to tonight's panel discussion entitled Populism in its Prime, a Challenge to the International Order. I'm Stanislav Dimitri Skrabin. I'm the president of the Defense and Diplomacy Policy Center at the King's think tank. And I'll be moderating tonight's debate on this very relevant issue, particularly after last Tuesday. So first of all, about the King's think tank, it is the largest student policy center, as you can see, of its kind in Europe. And we currently encompass about 5,000 members and counting. So what we do, might be a bit unclear, is we discuss relevant issues and attempt to write, we do write policy on it and submit it to relevant policy makers. And we do this through multiple policy centers, so there's defense and diplomacy, global health, education, European affairs, law. So if that kind of interests you, do have a look, but more about that later. We also have a kind of more physical side, so we do have a physical result of our policy writing, which is a journal, The Spectrum, which you can write for as well, but I'll talk about that later. So the event tonight will have each speaker deliver a 10 to 12 minute speech on the issue of populism, after which we'll have a question and answer session where you can ask questions basically to either individual panels or to the entire panel. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to say that this is, according to our Students' Union, a safe space, so all of you should feel safe here. There's no room for threats or kind of any violence or hate speech, and if you do feel in some way that your safe space is being encroached upon, do address us after the lecture, please. Before we get started, I have an announcement from the president of the King's think tank, Hilary Manning.
Hello everyone. So we have outstanding expert panel events, which are incredible and, as you see, well attended, but we also have fun social events. And so I'm announcing the King's think tank's Christmas party, Saturday, 3rd of December. We are starting to sell tickets at £5 deposit. We are doing 2-course Calvary black tie event at the Strand Palace Hotel. Myself and Ryan will be down here selling tickets should you come. So we have a fun side to us as well. So just wanted to let you know. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilary. So, their world is collapsing. Ours is being built. That's what Marine Le Pen's chief strategist said last Tuesday after the victory of Donald Trump in the US elections. Populism and the far right have seemingly achieved the biggest prize of all, that the most powerful seat in the world is now occupied by a man who is a populist. Britain has already succumbed to populism in the referendum. Austria narrowly avoided the victory of a populist presidential candidate. Germany, where I come from, struggles with its own populist entities, as signified by the Alternative für Deutschland. And in Italy, populist movements are actively challenging the fragile political system. And France, well, after Donald Trump, I think a lot of French people really do consider Le Pen a viable presidential candidate for next year. And on the other side of the world, Rodrigo Duterte has tested the limits of human decency and human rights in his campaign and has successfully become the president of the Philippines. All these victories, and in such a short period of time, make us not just wonder, but actively question two things. First, how can we explain the rise of populism in modern-day politics? And second, and how does this rising populism affect the international order? To discuss these questions, we have invited a panel of authors from the board of academia, media, and from think tanks in order to look at this topic from any angle possible. So to begin with, on my far right and your far left, Dr. Pablo de Orellana. Dr. Pablo de Orellana is a teaching fellow at the Department of War Studies here at King's College London and focuses primarily on diplomacy, international relations theory, and especially on the subject of nationalism. Dr. de Orellana will be speaking to us about the academic perspective on populism, the issue of identity politics, understanding how populism uses historical grievances in a cycle to use contemporary issues to justify historical grievances and to gain popularity. He will also look at the effect on society and on the domestic realm of populism. Next, Michael White, who is replacing Joel Phillips, I think as you've all observed. She could sadly not make it tonight. Mr. White, however, is the former political editor of The Guardian and currently an associate editor at The Guardian. With over 30 years of experience in the field, Mr. White will be talking to us about the role of the media in the coverage of populism, how it is used by populists to change the social narrative and the media narrative, and we will also be looking at the role of spin doctors and other actors in the media. Next, Mr. Stefan Lehne, a visiting scholar from Carnegie Europe and a former Director General of Political Affairs at the Austrian Ministry of European International Affairs. Mr. Lehne has worked extensively within the EU and will talk about the effects of populism on European state affairs, both domestically and in foreign relations, and what this means for the international community. And lastly, Dr. Angelos Chrysogelos, Academy Associate Chatham House and also a teaching fellow within the Department of European International Studies. His research has largely focused on the activities of far right, particularly in Greece and in Europe. Dr. Chrysogelos will share with us his thoughts on populism in the broader context from Europe, so connections of populist parties to foreign entities like in the US or particularly in Russia, and how populist entities will establish themselves abroad. Lastly, Dr. Chrysogelos will probably give us some insight onto the effect of Trump's presidency on the future of populist parties. So with that, I'd like to open the floor as Dr. Derolana.
No. I really don't want to use it. Can everyone hear me? I'd really rather not be mediated, but obviously failing technology. So first of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the KCL think tank. It's a fantastic initiative that keeps yielding. And thank you for coming so late in the evening. I'm not sure I would have come to an 8 p.m. event on something quite this depressing. So what I'll try to do is give you a couple of intellectual frames to think about populism in the last decade. Analytical frames, drawing on network actor theory, critical theory, and identity theories, to try to see how we can crack open this problem, how we can examine the corpses in the political battlefield of our time. So, the obvious face of populism is Trump, Farage, Le Pen, Sanders, Iglesias, Grillo. These are the faces of populism in our time. And furthermore, we think of populism as these people, their movements. We think of populism, we speak of it, we write about it, we analyze it as an aberration, as a kind of exception in an otherwise tranquil political space. We use expressions like post-truth politics, as if politics was ever very truthful. And we listen to the claims of populists themselves. Farage saying, I'm leading a people's revolution. Trump's claims that he would drain the swamp of Washington. But let's not let them define what they're doing. It's not an exception. In fact, in many ways, populism has been the hardcore basis of politics for 3,000 years. We've got xenophobic pogroms happening in ancient Egypt. We've got an extremely well-documented moment, 20 years of populistic politics in the ancient Roman Republic. That's 2,200 years ago, when Cato the Elder caused a massive Trump-like phenomenon that led ancient Rome to annihilate Carthage, to commit genocide. And this was, Carthage was an enemy that had already been defeated. Okay? And so, populism that we're looking at today takes two main expressions, just to separate them and categorize them as simply as possible. On the one hand, we've got those drawing for support and for network making, to create a constituency and a weight of supporters. We've got those drawing on economic identities. Okay, so we've got the 99%, the indignados in Spain. Those left out, the idea that we have been screwed over by this establishment that panders only to the 1%. But this, having been screwed over, this narrative depends on me, you being part of those left behind. We identify as those that have been victims of a system. And then on the other hand, we've got those drawing on ethnic or nationalist, or most often both, identities. And this is by a long way the most successful wave of populism ever. It was true in the 1930s and it is true now. Why? Well, I would hazard that's because Marxist theory is just that little bit more complicated to understand than me and Foreigner. The finer details of alienation and historical materialism are rather difficult to explain to an electorate. But if we analyse the discourses fielded by these actors, we find that in fact the latter, the nationalist or ethnic identity, populisms in fact mix both. They link the problem of the foreigner to the problem of your economic discomfort. And it works very cleverly as an explanation. Like our left-wing populists would tell us that the rich have screwed us over. Well, your ethno-nationalist or nationalist populists tell you that it's foreigners that are taking your Jews. Now, this is a very, very specific type of xenophobia. I really want to highlight that this isn't just gratuitous xenophobia. This is a xenophobia that works on the assumption that what a foreigner takes, I cannot have. The idea that foreigners come, take jobs, benefits, scroungers, all these things, yeah? And they commit crime and they bring diseases, blah, blah, blah. All of my discomfort explained by this nationalist, ethnic, sometimes even regional lens. Now, this is very, very obvious in Trump, who's been speaking about NAFTA, who's been speaking about the 1% Washington elites, who has been bashing Clinton for her Wall Street links. Yeah? So we have this idea that it's the foreigners to blame for an economic problem. And this, I think, is what makes them so powerful. In Poland right now, the nationalist government mixes extremely strident xenophobia, which is fascinating considering it's the European country that has the least foreigners. They mix this with extremely generous welfare. I read 2 days ago that Poland has not seen welfare handouts, wealth transfer, on this scale since the end of communism. Now this is remarkable, that the two are coming together as a movement to unite a constituency. And so we have xenophobia linked to the explanation as to why you feel unwell, why you have less coins in your pocket. But I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at their opponents, those that have tried and failed to stop them. So the Clinton campaign, the Remainer campaign here in the UK, we find that they either ignore these grievances or displace them, put them somewhere else. So in some ways, we have to face, I think, the hard reality that populists are not entirely wrong when they claim that mainstream politics is a consensus. And it is quite clearly a consensus around economy, what the economy should be like. And we're really looking at a neoliberal consensus. Yeah? Thatcher said in the 1980s, neoliberalism will float all the boats. The grievance that populists are talking to is the fact that it would appear that only the yachts are floating and the rest of us are still underwater as the tide rose. Now, this is not to say that Trump, Farage, Le Pen are socialists or even care at all about these grievances. We can't look into their heads. But I would argue that their success is to have spoken about these grievances, to have appealed to them, to have at least the pretense that they're looking at it, that they know that you are suffering from this problem, that they know that something has to be done about it, not just ignored or wait for the market to resolve itself. And that's why they've been speaking about the EU, NAFTA, globalization, very, very, very explicitly. And this is a very, very powerful form of identity politics in yet another way, in that it creates a network, sometimes entirely out of the blue. For instance, my latest big grievance is that King's has banned smoking in the courtyard downstairs. I hate it. I'm extremely angry about it. And so, I define myself partly by my fury every time I have to walk down 7 flights of stairs and walk 10 minutes across either Somerset House or the Terrace to go for a cigarette, in between seminars. And so, I might identify with maybe a student union movement, a staff movement, a union movement, that amongst its claims has the restoration of smoking in the courtyard. I might at least consider lending them my support. What has happened here, theory tells us, is that we have linked my grievance, my own interpretation of the grievance, to a very general interpretation of the grievance that at the same time claims to create a constituency around it so as to resolve it. All the smokers unite. Yeah? Now, the key part to this is that populists also appear to offer solutions. Yeah? It's not just, this is the ex-student union movement that cares for your smoking in the courtyard. It is the ex-student union movement that cares about smoking in the courtyard and will restore it. Let's vote the pro-smokers. Another key factor that is not down to the populists, and in many ways explains why such a party of idiots has got so far, is another failure by the opposition, but a very, very specific type of failure. I would say that a great part of their success is that conventional politicians, your mainstream left and right, have been playing catch-up with populists for the best part of 10, 15 years. Now, what happens here is rather refined, and this was analysis tells us rather cleverly that selectively picking, so for instance Sarkozy, when he was president, David Cameron, when he was prime minister, selectively picking part of the extreme right discourse. Yeah? Theresa May's big push was it was not racist to talk about immigration, yeah? Or to question immigration. So by cherry-picking part of the discourse, they legitimize the populist movement, and yet, because they're cherry-picking, they fail to offer any solutions. So what ends up happening is that, and this happened to Sarkozy, he tried to race Marine Le Pen, and ended up helping, of course, the socialists almost by default because he lost so many votes to them. He lost share of the vote, even amongst the anti-immigration constituencies. And this is vital because what he ended up doing is saying, I'm a softie, but I agree that this is a problem. So you as the voter are not going to vote for me softie, you're going to vote for the guy that seems to have the heaviest solution, mass deportations, build a big wall, execute the foreigners, whatever else they can invent. And so we have the mainstream politics building a platform, nailing the planks of wood for populism to have a ready-made conventional politics platform. This is a big move that explains a great deal of their success. You could argue that David Cameron did very much the same. And the problem with this is that every time mainstream politicians try to ride this extremely powerful dragon, they cannot control it. It throws them off, because this dragon has one logic. In the case of UKIP, immigration causing all of your problems. When the rider has failed to do anything about these grievances, or indeed address them in any discursively powerful way, the dragon says, no, I want someone that will work harder towards this solution. That's how Theresa May, in some ways, has sought to save the Tory party after the Brexit referendum by absorbing most of UKIP's referendum-era platform. The focus on migration particularly, dumping her own party's previous focus on sovereignty. And finally, I think that the opposition, particularly on the left and at the centre, the old liberal centre, is failing in yet another way. It is so convinced of the absurdity of populism that they seem to be just waiting for the votes to come back. Jeremy Corbyn's speech in the conference, people are having economic problems, they will come to us. That was the essence of his hour-long speech. I got an email from my local Liberal Democrats this morning. Let me cite a line from it. I used to work for the deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats, I have to confess. I'm sorry. I understand that it's difficult to say this to the student body. And it starts like this. Of course, the email is asking for money, for support, and for me to write a couple of speeches. But it starts like this. Fighting for liberal values has never been more important. And that's basically the basis of it all. They need us. We need liberalism. Where is the linking to the grievances? Where is even the pathetic attempt to say, I know you're suffering from lack of money? Where is the offering of solutions? The problem here is that in the ideological economy of our time, many of these actors on the left and the centre, and sometimes even on the classical conservative right, are working on the assumption that their politics are self-explanatory and that their solutions are self-explanatory. Mostly on the basis that they've been there for a long time. Yeah? Now, if this continues like this, we have to work on the assumption that there is no significant challenge to populism. It will have to collapse on its own, like 1930s populism. Now, this is a terrible prediction to make, but going less extreme, perhaps looking at the current and immediate effects of the international order of populism, I would have 5 predictions to advance, some more scary than others. The first is quite simple. If these grievances are not addressed, the dragon will seek a more extreme proponent. Yeah? I would argue that this is how Tea Party became Trump. This is already happening. 2. Nationalism begets more nationalism because of this zero-sum logic. Yeah? Wherever you have a nationalist on the other side of the border, more nationalism will arise to challenge it. Putin and Poland are a hilarious example of this. But in practice, it means that nationalism will continue informing national policy, particularly what we define as interests if you're a realist. In practice, this means that we're going to have more ethno-nationalist conflict, i.e. Ukraine, Crimea, yeah? More trade wars. It looks like Trump is preparing himself to do something awful to NAFTA. We still don't know what, but something terrible and decisive, he tells us. And whatever happens, something that will be great. You see? He's offering solutions. They are vague, but he's offering great solutions. 3. If either Le Pen or Sarkozy win the French presidency, all 5 permanent members of the Security Council would be nationalists. This is big. This will change international dynamics inevitably. 4, as an outcome of the previous 2, international collaboration, multilateral conflict, humanitarian collaboration, and resolution, I think, will be the first victims of this. And finally, and this is the scariest, but I think we see this in Trump, and we see this here, with the anger towards Parliament over Brexit and the High Court and Supreme Court challenge of democracy, which is failing to address these grievances sober appear. We lose value every day. In the economy of our ideology and how we feel about politics, democracy every day will seem ever less powerful, ever less able to address our real problems, and we will ever more look for outside players that are talking to my grievances, to my problems, and are offering some form of solution. In practice, looking at history, but also looking at theory, what really we find here is not that lots of dictatorships will violently come about. The 1930s shows very clearly that what really happened there was that the political economy made it easier for democracies to become dictatorships. For democracies to vote sometimes to become dictatorships. Right, so that's as much doom and gloom as I can manage this evening.
Wow, exactly. Thank you, Dr. Joel, for a very fantastic. Very enticing, and as we War Studies kids know, very vocal speech. Yeah, chilling amount of future predictions there. I certainly hope that these will not occur, but as we've been told, as we've been told, think the unthinkable. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Mr. White.
Okay, I'll avoid your microphone too. If you can't hear me at the back, rather the jewellery. Not a lot there I'd disagree with, except on your list of the drivers of nationalism, what seemed to be one conspicuous omission was what we might call cultural populism, in which I would impolitely include religious populism, so that ISIS is part of this, and anti-feminism, anti-gay, anti-abortion, things of that kind, and they manifest themselves in different ways in all our societies. We'll come back to that. In 1989, probably some of you in this room were born, the year the Berlin Wall fell down and the Soviet Union began to implode, and therefore the countervailing power to American global ascendancy disappeared, as well as the ideological ballast which sustained more democratic forms of socialism in the West. In that year, Francis Fukuyama, Japanese-American, with a good typing style, wrote a book called The End of History, in which it was all going to be liberal democracy from here out, more or less. And I thought, ooh, that's you're pushing your luck there, Frank. Because it seemed to me, I read Declaration of Interest, I read history at UCL, graduated 50 years ago this summer. That history is not like that at all, and that history, like time, it isn't a linear phenomenon, it's a cycle, much as the cycle of the moon and the cycles of nature are indeed the cycles of all of us. I'm closer to the end of my time than you are, probably. And that given what happened after 30 or 40 years of enormous economic success after the ruins of 1945, we were due some kind of unpleasant economic and, by implication, as Paolo has said, political correction, rather like New Zealand expecting another earthquake. I certainly agree that all our problems have been exacerbated by economic distress, which bears down upon some communities more than others. And that's the point I reinforce what you've implicitly said. Lots of the grievances which drive populism are not without some validity. I think most of the remedies offered by mountebanks, charlatans, billionaires posing as men of the people, and public school boys from South London like Nigel Farage, most of the solutions they offer are risibly simplistic and inept. Panacea of populism, I sometimes call it. But that's not to say that UKIP voters or Le Pen voters or out-of-work factory workers in Ohio, Northern Ohio, I haven't been there for 10 years, and it won't have got any better, and it wasn't very nice then. That's also true of Atlantic City, the casino city on New Jersey, just south of New York, which Trump promised to rescue 30 years ago before Mr. Fukuyama put pen to paper, it is in far worse shape now than it was when Donald arrived. So some of those grievances are legitimate, but we're in a cycle where they're going to grow. Is it a spasm or is it something more serious? I'm afraid it might be something more serious on the evidence, because one thing Paolo said, which I've never heard articulated before, if I was sitting at the back I might even tweet it, didn't mean that. That if Sarkozy wins the French presidency, which he won't, but if Marine Le Pen wins the French presidency, which I would have said 6 months ago she certainly won't, but not putting any euros on that one anymore, then the P5 will be dominated by authoritarian nationalists, because President Xi in China, few of us speak Mandarin, so we don't follow it that closely, is up to the same caper, as is Mr. Erdogan and many people who haven't been mentioned yet, but will be mentioned by other panelists. Now, populism and media. Is populism a matter of style or of substance? Well, it's a bit of both. Stylistically, it tends to be simple, it tends to be direct, it tends to be demotic. It's prone to paranoia and xenophobia, as we've heard from others. And in substance, of course, it's prone to simple solutions, panacea solutions, as I call them, in varying degrees. I thought coming over, now, was Margaret Thatcher a populist? On balance, no, because her arguments and her conduct and the coherence of her policies, most of them, she was a bit naive about capitalism, were underpinned, had respectable intellectual underpinnings by monetarists and by others and by neoconservatives, whereas Ronald Reagan, you could argue, although a much nicer person, I'm afraid he'd make you laugh if he came through the door. Ronald Reagan, you could fairly be called a populist, and there's a fine line there. Reagan famously said, people say hard work never killed anybody, but I say, why take the chance? Mrs. Thatcher wasn't like that at all. Simplistic style, demotic style, simplistic solutions. This is perfect for modern mass media. Now, this stuff has been going around forever, but modern media in the sense of radio in the 30s, important to Hitler, Mussolini, and to the radio fascist Father Coughlin in the United States, and to Huey Long, left-wing populist, I guess you would say. Long was governor of Louisiana, taxed the oil companies, every man a king, assassinated for his pains. Left populists as well as right. Let's remember Hugo Chavez and even unpopulists like Jeremy and Bernie Saunders. Who won that once? He was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. that radio and latterly television, and of course has been said here, digital media, social media, Breitbart News has now got its man installed in the heart of the White House as chief policy advisor, because the other fellow got the chief of staff job. An astonishing thought, because from the standpoint of a mainstream media man for the last 50 years, unmediated media, particularly when it can be actively used to disseminate untruths, which is something you'll see, those of you who still buy papers, damn you, and those of you who get it free online. Fox News, Facebook is having to grapple with truthified news in a big way today. What are we going to do about it? Those of you who don't follow these things because you're meant to be working, at the beginning of the election, the Trump campaign did what these people always do, the Daily Mail does to the BBC every day. They bully them and say, you're getting a lot of liberal pro-Clinton news up on your news website, 1.5 billion people are following it, and it isn't fair and it's not balanced. What is old Zuckerman? He's terribly successful, terribly rich, and terribly clever, and never lacking in common sense. He puts a lot of them on the job. They'll do the job impartially. Well, yes, they do, but they're not interested in the truth vis-a-vis the non-truth. They're interested in clickbait. So they put up the big stuff. Wow. So that seems to me a really very important driver of what's been happening to us and what's been driving mainstream politics ever more. Every new Prime Minister, Theresa May included, comes in saying, I'm not going to allow my government and my time and my agenda and my stuff to be driven by the 24/7, real old tech, 24/7 news. It's only about 25 years old. The news cycle of the 24/7 media. When I was your age, a good story lasted a week. Nowadays it lasts 2 or 3 hours. And it consumes itself in this strange, destructive way. You know, earthquake in China, 10,000 people dead. Hey, that happened yesterday, didn't it? I did a radio broadcast on Radio 5 Live the night after 9/11. And 24 hours later, and we hooked up to a radio station in Chicago, just as an experiment. It was all been pre-arranged, and after about 10 or 15 minutes earnest talking, the guy in Chicago says, we're a drive time program, can't we be a bit more cheerful? You seem to have been spending a lot of time on this accident in New York. And we said, well, don't wish to be rude, it's actually rather important. And he said, only 2 or 3 people are dead. They've only found 2 or 3 bodies, and one of our number on a panel like this said to Chicago, don't know why I'm telling this story, but I started, said to Chicago, well, that's because the bodies are vaporized. It's 10,000. This guy in Chicago. News is very transient, and it gets ever more so in the news cycle. And this suits Nigel Farage very well, because he can get up on the air and say, hey, selfie with me and Don. Theresa May doesn't seem to have a plan, and then he's moved on and resumed his private life, as he's gone back to play golf. But we don't have time to say, hey Nigel, what's your plan? It was your idea. And this is how the mechanics works to a considerable extent. Well, where do mainstream media fit into this? Well, rather as Paolo described, the reaction of mainstream politics, do we resist it with passion and conviction? You could say that in opposing all restrictions on immigration, Jeremy Corbyn has done that, to which I would say you don't seem to realise that Labour voters sitting in their constituencies and going to the GP and trying to get a place for little Johnny or little Mohammed to go to school, suddenly find that little Stefan and his 3 sisters from Krakow have got the places. These aren't imagined problems, they're real problems. They can be addressed with courage and honesty, but the mainstream media, particularly the conservative media, the liberal media makes similar mistakes in a different way, appeases this. It says Nigel Farage was a terrible man, but. And I watched last week the Daily Mail, which is, I regret saying this, but it's true, the most energetic and the most clever newspaper in this country. Not the FT at all, although I prefer the FT. I've been reading The Daily Mail attacked Trump throughout the campaign. And on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, I thought, let's see how they turn around. And sure, they've turned around, and the politicians have turned around. Well, you have to deal with people in life. You don't pick your friends or your enemies, and sometimes it's awkward. You play them along, maybe they'll change. After all, Trump's acceptance speech was a major betrayal of his supporters. You've got to remember this. He referred to that woman, that criminal, that's Hillary. He said she'd done a good job. Said something nice about Obama. And he wanted to govern for all the Americans. Well, that's not what a lot of his supporters wanted or expected him to see. And social media was again full of cries of betrayal. This is the first, you forgot to say betrayal. Betrayal is what drives populism, of both left and right. We've been wrong. And it was out there on social media. So we could say that the rumour mill has been around forever. Paolo rightly mentioned misfortunes of the late Roman Republic, and indeed the Athenian democracy, which succumbed to authoritarian populism too, not as a result of defeat in war, but later. Rumour has been around, whose child is found dead in the field, who killed him? Jews, Muslims, witches, we all know the story. Foreigners killed them. Black boys in Mississippi looking at a white woman. Let's go and lynch a couple. And that was all pre-internet, most of it human beings have always been like this, where there isn't strong enough institutions and authority to stop them. And the hope against Mr. Trump, a hope which has never been an option in either contemporary Russia, the USSR, or indeed in Tsarist Russia, is that the institutions of the state and the constitution will be strong enough to hold them back. And don't assume that they won't. We all have to end on an optimistic note. America has lawyers behind every tree, and enough of them will be out there, as there were against the unconstitutional nature of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center and other things. You know, American lawyers, 10% is enough. American lawyers can be quite impressive when they're on a good cause. Right, what was I going to say before I finish? Something you just said. I mentioned religious and cultural. Yes, there's an odd thing to watch out for here, and again, turns up in the media all the time, is that the fault is the fault of our disappointments. We all have disappointments, writ large on society, is the fault of the liberal elite. It's a very economical two-word phrase, like Cato the Elder, one of the first great soundbites in the ancient world. Carthage must be destroyed. You can see it on the car bumper stickers, on the old badges, on the TV ad, 15-second spots. Okay. Tehran must be eliminated. I've lost my thread. Anyway, political correctness, the liberal elites, but the word liberal in this context encompasses two almost diametrically opposing impulses. We could say, others may disagree, that the political arguments of the last 30 years have been won in economic terms by the free market right, what Mrs. Thatcher would call liberal economics, 19th century Manchester Guardian economics, free trade and open borders. Well, the cultural wars, to which I alluded, have been won, broadly speaking, by the left. But you can bundle up both contradictory impulses in attacking the liberal elite and meaning different things to different audiences. Because I thought you were slightly wrong. Xenophobia, unless racism, misogyny, all that stuff. So there's a whole lot bundled up in the Brexit vote, as there is in the Trump vote. And sovereignty, for many people you wouldn't expect it to be, bus drivers in Bradford and ex-miners coughing their guts out in Scotland, but voting SNP, they're voting SNP for sovereignty. And it's not true that Nigel Farage is the most successful populist, nationalist, now operating in the British Isles, a far more impressive and more successful figure who's interested in power and not grandstanding, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. And that's a sobering thought, partly because it reminds us she's a pretty respectable figure, Mrs. Sturgeon. I mean, I don't think Brexit is going to do Scotland any more good than I think Brexit is going to do Britain. But, you know, she's not a demagogue, and she's not a racist, and she's certainly not a misogynist, and she's a pretty sharp politician. But sovereignty, potent notion in an interdependent world, it's your point four, that interconnectedness and mutual dependence are at risk from what we're seeing now. And I'm 71. I was born in 1945 at the end of the war, when Europe lay in ruins as a consequence of populist nationalism as it emerged from the failures of the First War, the post-war settlement at Versailles, and economic failure after the great crash of 1929. Well, the parallels, I don't have to spell them out for you. And I've been lucky all my life. When I was born, 1945, an important detail, the boys didn't get home from the war till late 45, and therefore all the people who were competing to beat the jobs weren't born. My father was a bit on it. Weren't born until 46. Head start, as well as everything else. It makes a difference. But we're beginning to run out of luck, and I'm beginning to run out of luck, because you're all going to be too busy working to care for me when I start peeing my trousers. So what goes round, goes round. You have enormous advantages which people my age didn't have in this city. What a rat hole it was, smog everything. Don't get me going. On the other hand, just to finish on an irritating note, I lived in Bloomsbury House in my third year, in a university rooming house for which I paid £2 a week.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wright, for that, and that personal touch as well, and the overall more optimistic approach. We will now have Mr. Lehman.
But you mentioned Francis Fukuyama, after the not so clever idea that history has ended in 89, he went on to write a number of excellent books. And he also has something to say on populism. He says, for instance, that populism is the label put by the elites on policies that are popular with ordinary people and that they don't like. And I think there's some truth to that. I think populism is an inherent element of democracy. It's not the enemy of it. It's really part of it. During the tension, it's a way in which politics can be adjusted to changes in society. If the concern is not taken seriously by the elites, populist movements will form and put this on the agenda. So in a way that is a healthy development. But of course there are huge risks involved in this, and they have been mentioned here too. And one of the risks is that populists are terrible at foreign policy, which is supposed to be my subject. They don't like foreigners or foreign things, and they're not very keen on policy either. So if they put these two things together, it usually doesn't work out. It has been pointed out, but I think this has to be mentioned again, that the rise of populism runs parallel to the decline of sovereignty. The notion of the state as a self-governing community in which power is exercised in the name of the people is overtaken by events. Your fate is determined by what national politicians do and decide, but also what happens in financial markets, in transnational corporations, in international organizations, in crises in faraway regions. All this can impact on your life very much. And this is something that is profoundly resented by populist movements. There are very nostalgic of the golden age of the nation state. And the common definition that is that basically the populists divide everyone between us, the pure people, and the corrupt and self-serving elites. And usually the pure people are nations, and the elite is usually international. So I think Marine Le Pen put it particularly well when she said the world is divided between patriots and globalizers. And this shows very well this very stark division. And if that's where you're coming from, you don't like the EU. That's very obvious. The EU is the ultimate transnational project based on the joint and exercise of national sovereignty. And the EU's narrative is very much based on interdependence. This is seen as a guarantee for security. The populists see it exactly the opposite way around. For them, interdependence is a threat, it's a risk, something that needs to be avoided, that needs to be stopped. So the left and the right both dislike the EU, some for the common reasons and some for the wrong reasons. They see it as an engine of liberalization, engine of globalization. And they're not totally wrong. I recently looked again at the beginning of the Treaty of Rome that will have its 60th anniversary next March. And it sounds like basically a sermon on liberalization, removing obstacles to trade, creating space for entrepreneurs, making sure that the international order is liberal. It's in the DNA of the EU to be a liberalizing force. And that, of course, is something that populists absolutely don't like. The leftist critique is that it is an ally of the 1% of the international corporations, that it imposes austerity on poor people, particularly in the southern countries, that it sells out on economic and social and environmental standards. The right focus very much on immigration. For them, the freedom of movement is something that is undercutting national sovereignty, which actually consists in controlling who comes in and who goes out of the territory. Schengen and even the physical control is coming, so this needs to be abolished. But it's not just migration that is resented by the right, but also the values agenda of the EU, the protection of minorities, including LGBT minorities. Gay Europe is one of the slogans against the European Union. Both sides, left and right, think that the European integration process has gone far too far. And some movements, the Front National and the Cinque Stelle in Italy, focus very much on the euro, and others want to get rid of the EU altogether. I think this juxtaposition between national sovereignty, which is good, and transnational international integration project, which is bad, explains why this notion, take back control, the slogan of the Brexit campaign, had such resonance, not just in the UK, but they could export it easily to other parts of Europe because many people really came to that. Now, how much of this threat is populism to the European Union? If you look at the results of the voting, you have altogether about 20 countries in which populist movements have more than 10% of the vote. There are 5 countries in the EU where they have the largest groups in parliament, and now there are 6 countries in the European Union where populist forces are part of the governing coalition. That's quite a change. In my own country, Austria, in the year 2000, we had the first coalition involving the FPÖ, and at that time the other EU countries decided on political sanctions, diplomatic sanctions against Austria, something that lasted couple of months and then it was abandoned. But still, at this time, this was seen as breaking the taboo. Now it's normal, basically, to include populist parties in government. Altogether, their voting share is about 16.5%. That doesn't seem to be a great deal. I think overall, majority mainstream parties are still in charge and not likely to go out of business soon. The exceptions are Hungary and Poland, where populist forces are rather too firmly in control. But this 16.5% is misleading because the real influence of these parties is much greater. Just take UKIP as an example. Without UKIP, which I found it very, very difficult to make it into the UK Parliament, there would never have been a referendum on Brexit. They're setting the agenda, they're driving force, they're scaring the mainstream parties. We mentioned Sarkozy, another case in point of a mainstream politician or former mainstream politician that tries to outflank Marine Le Pen on the right. And therefore, there's a huge influence of these parties, much greater than the actual share in vote. They also have a wonderful method to drive the agenda, that is direct democracy. I think there is everywhere in the West a certain crisis of representative democracy. We trust the politicians much less. If you look at all the indicators from participation in votes, from membership in parties, from interest in politics, from confidence in politicians, the trends are down everywhere. What is popular is direct democracy as an alternative. And populists find this a wonderful mobilizing tool. Now, direct democracy has lots of merits, and a referendum which is well prepared, and if there is a good context for it, can be a very good thing. But these conditions are hardly ever there. There's only one country in the world, basically, that turned referenda into a successful standard part of its politics, and that is Switzerland. Frequently, referenda campaigns are subject to manipulation. They're influenced by extraneous factors. You always get an answer, but frequently it's not to the question that has actually been asked. And referenda on EU policies are particularly problematic because they have extraterritorial effects. A very small majority in the Netherlands voted against the free trade agreement with the UK, and de facto blocked a project that had support of the democratically elected parliaments in all the EU countries, including the Netherlands. That's the question, is that democracy or is it rather the lack of democracy? Now, the next big test of course, is the referendum in Italy on the 4th of December, which will decide on the fate of Mr. Renzi. And then you have a series of elections in France, in the Netherlands, and in Germany. I think altogether, chances are still that you'll end up with mainstream parties getting the upper hand in just about all these elections. But after last Wednesday, I again wouldn't bet a great deal on it. Now, how should center-right and center-left politicians respond to the challenge from populism? I think there's one bad way of responding to it. Unfortunately, it is a very popular way to do that. That is basically imitating the narrative, running after them, adopting part of their agenda. Usually this is not successful because voters then go for the real thing and these parties lose. But also it is the wrong strategy. The right strategy is, first of all, to address the underlying concerns. And it's quite clear that in the European Union there needs to be a rebalancing between freedom and protection, basically. I think the EU has gone a bit too far in the liberalizing agenda and has not done enough to protect those who are losers from globalization. It has not addressed inequality issue, which is driving a lot of the anger. much more needs to be done in harmonizing taxes, in going after the evasion of taxes, in attacking corruption, in making sure that those who lose out from this process are protected and can move forward. I think the other thing that needs to be done is that the mainstream parties need to engage the populist forces in a dialogue on the substantive issues. That they frequently avoid, but that is a very successful strategy because in most cases populist forces have no convincing answers. Most of the big challenges of the 21st century are of a transnational nature. The global climate change, migration, the financial order, all that can only be handled through international engagement, international cooperation, things that are rejected by the populists. And if there is a substantive dialogue, we found many of the populist emperors have no clothes, and that is therefore, I think, a strategy that can be successful. Finally, just a few words on Donald Trump and the consequences. I think the Trump election clearly is a game changer. Trump stands for things that are completely inimical to what the US stood for throughout decades. He rejects the liberal trade order, international trade order, he rejects new trade agreements, he is opposed to, he says at one point, climate change is an invention by the Chinese. He has very strange policies regarding non-proliferation. He would give up the deal with Iran. He believes that Korea and Japan should develop nuclear armaments. He's deeply ambivalent about the US-backed military alliances. He says, well, we will only protect the Baltic states if they paid for it, which is a strange notion. He seems to be very transactional overall on international relations, basically from the view of a deal maker. If there can be a deal, he will go for it. Worst of all, I think he says that the US has been far too predictable in its conduct of foreign policy. He says unpredictable is a great strength. I think that's one thing that he's very credible about because his totally contradictory messages on foreign policy already indicate a great deal of unpredictability. Now, of course, everybody hopes that he doesn't mean what he said in the campaign, and that the conservative establishment of the Republican Party will embrace him. They will mitigate his worst instincts and drive him into a safer direction. Nobody can be sure because I think he got where he was by ignoring the advice of all the moderate advisors of the Republican Party. So we simply don't know. I think as far as the Europe is concerned, the Trump election is the ultimate wake-up call. I think it's being conditioned over decades, basically, to follow the American lead. And if no American lead was forthcoming, frequently the result was a paralysis. And this clearly cannot go on. I think we have now to prepare for a considerable period where the US is not a constructive factor on international relations. And the European states finally have to get their act together. I think Barbara has mentioned the kind of waves of populism that we've experienced throughout history, and I wouldn't go as far as back in history as he did, but for instance there was a big wave, populist wave, in the 1870s and 1880s, after a big depression actually. The word populism was coined for an American party, the People's Party, that wanted to keep Chinese workers out of the US labor market. And I think ultimately this kind of, and also you can say that the extreme nationalism prior to the First World War and the rise of fascism in the 20s and 30s were also responses towards a rather liberal world also at that stage. I think this, to some extent, is reassuring for us. 1 week after the Trump election, ultimately, the this kind of falling back into nationalism is not sustainable. I think the international order requires cooperation and engagement, and people will come back to their senses. The tricky thing is, of course, that we don't know how much damage will happen in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lena. A very in-depth, interesting look at the EU and the consequences of populism. Now we'll have our last speaker, Dr. Andros Chrysogelos.
No, it's fine. Can anyone hear me? Has anyone of you shared on Facebook or Twitter over the last month that meme that shows Donald Trump saying in an interview to Forbes magazine in 1998 that if I ever were to run, I would run as a Republican because Republican voters are the most stupid? Has anyone of you shared that? Great. Was it true or was it a hoax? False. How populist do you feel now? Free trade. Last time is Liam Fox and Boris Johnson, are they anti-free trade? Are they all about anti-free trade? No, we actually want free trade with anyone but from Europe, right? It's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Botswana, you name it, right? If it's the Commonwealth, even better. Donald Trump, you mentioned the Republican establishment that will bring census. In questions of reproductive rights, gay marriage, abortion, all of those things, does anyone here feel more comfortable with Trump running the shots or the Republican establishment running the shots in America? Is Bernie Sanders a populist? Yes. Is he against foreigners? Yeah. Bernie Sanders is against foreigners.
I'm the only one here who knows it.
Closer to Europe, in my country, one of the preeminent examples of left-wing populism, the current Prime Minister of Greece, actually allowed free passage to 1 million Syrians fleeing war. My point is that trying to pin down populism in terms of policy is actually doesn't lead us anywhere, right? It is a flawed conceptual exercise, because populism is, you can see it as a culture, a language, a style of politics, a tool, but that means that if you actually try to distill all the policy elements of populism based on what all the populists in the world believe, you basically end up with everything, and therefore with nothing. My point, the argument I would make, and I say it's already 9:25, which is probably the latest I have ever lectured. Less than 12 hours in my seminar tomorrow morning. Some of my students here should appreciate that. My point is that populism should be understood as a logic of politics, right? And there is a strand of literature that basically tries to give us a more value-free understanding of populism. And it is a style, or I would say a mode, or a discourse, or a logic of politics that is confrontational, that is binary, that divides the political body and the political space into us versus them, usually in terms of the people versus power, or versus the elite. But what that means that where you take it on from there is highly contingent on political culture, economic circumstances, the global context, and so on and so forth. All right? Populism, I think most experiences of populism show us that populism is inclusive and exclusive at the same time. All right? Is Donald Trump inclusive? If you're sitting in a trailer park in Northern Ohio, probably you think that it is very inclusive. All right? If you are a Mexican, a janitor somewhere in California, you probably think that he is exclusive. All right? If you are in Venezuela, and do you think that Hugo Chavez is inclusive or exclusive? If you live in certain parts of Caracas, you might have thought that he's very inclusive, because he's the first one to actually have an organized housing policy for the subaltern strata of Venezuela. If you live in a different area of Caracas, you might think that he's actually very exclusive, because all he ever did was to basically create this notion that some people are the legitimate society and others are not. So I think if we're going to be moralist about populism, we should be moralist only to the extent that we feel comfortable with a style of politics that is divisive, all right, and is divisive in very morally charged terms, okay? But the precise content of this divisiveness will differ, and also the practices of inclusion or exclusion are probably going to be present. You mentioned before the first agrarian populist party in the US. Yes, it didn't like Chinese migrant workers, but it also made sure, or at least advocated, for the state to build railways, for farmers to move freely their products to the cities. It advocated low GIP credit for farmers, and so on and so forth. So again, most populisms usually have this binary element, which is also very difficult to pin them down. Now, why populism today? And I think one way I would like you to think about it is to maybe escape the European framework necessarily, because first of all, populism, when modern political science started looking into populism, it actually didn't look at Europe at all. When populism was appearing in Europe, it was actually seen as an anomaly, because rich countries were not supposed to have populism, at least after World War II. All right? Populism was associated with anti-colonialist movements and kind of very popular and very kind of larger-than-life figures in what was called then the Third World. But think also today of a region like Latin America. Okay? Think of President Erdogan in Turkey. Think of Thailand, where actually, probably after the Populist Party of the US in the 1890s, it's the only other country where explicitly one political camp is called populist. I think there's even a suggestion in the military British constitution that they want to abolish populism. So I think we live in a populist moment that expresses itself in many different ways, in many different parts of the world, all right? And again, though, me saying that doesn't take us any further, because if it's just many different things that look differently in various parts of the world, what does it mean? What's the common thread that keeps them together? And my idea is, has been touched upon before, that populism appears not only when you have economic crisis, because normally if the economy doesn't go well, you might as well vote for the opposing party. I think it appears in contexts where you have an economic crisis and a crisis of political representation at the same time. And in today's world, the notion of a crisis of political representation acquires a new meaning. Because in a globalized world, where people still vote or still think about their politics in a national way, right? And therefore, the notion that national governments cannot do that much to mediate or moderate or remedy economic crisis feeds a lot into this sense of helplessness that normal politics, through the normal channels, is not enough. Why? Because governments themselves are constrained. Why? They're constrained because they have signed up to the EU. They have signed up to the World Trade Organization. They have signed up to the IMF. Three of the most important populist leaders that arose around the same time arose out of very, very similar circumstances in quite different parts of the world. President Erdogan in Turkey, faction Sinowat in Thailand, and the Kirchners in Argentina all came to power in the early 2000s following severe crisis of their country's finances and involvement of the IMF. why wouldn't they vote for the socialists? Why wouldn't they vote for the nationalists? Why wouldn't they vote for the Maoists? The key here is that the involvement of national economies and national politics in dense webs of international institutions and transnational flows of economy and capital creates precisely this feeling that national politics is helpless. And therefore comes populism. Populism is basically a different advocacy for a different kinds of democracy. I think it's very important to understand that populism is not regressive and it's not backwards looking, all right? Populism does not reject modernity, it radicalizes elements of modernity, all right? Public participation, voting, welfare state entitlements, social identities. Populism radicalizes all of those things. It wants them, but it only wants them for some kind of people within the community. Right? Or it wants more of them only for a certain kind of people in the political community. So I think that populism is a very specific kind of reaction to situations where basically traditional representative or other kinds of democracy is found lacking in a globalized world. And I think this creates, particularly for Western countries, this creates a huge problem, because in so doing they make democracy itself the field of contestation of its own character. Now, why would I say something like that at 9:35 p.m. Let me make this clear. Classical liberal democracy is supposed to contain a liberal element, checks and balances, institutions, procedures, rule of law, protection of minorities, and a majoritarian element, all right, elections, the will of the many. And liberal democracy is supposed to be a balance between the two. Increasingly in the Western world, we see that elections are becoming about the nature of democracy itself, all right? Because in a system where national political systems are seen as tied up by extensive institutions of globalization and global governance, the only position is actually a position that goes against the notion of the liberal element, the liberal pillar of democracy, checks and balances, institutions, procedures, all right? So it's actually ironic that when the Western world was first started pushing democracy in other parts of the world, the Middle East, Africa, it was always like, I mean, those people are voting there, what if the wrong guy wins? What if, for example, Islamists win in Gaza? Well, now the Western world is experiencing the own thing itself. We're more and more having elections where it's actually not about whether the right or the left is going to win, but whether about the wrong guy or the wrong gal, or the wrong madame, I suppose, will win. All right? Another thing about sovereignty or isolationism. I think it's also important to understand that if there is such a thing as the foreign policy philosophy of populists, it is not necessarily isolation. Donald Trump has said both that going to Iraq was a mistake, and he also wants to bomb ISIS back into the Stone Age. All right? So what gives there? The Front National or the FPÖ, I would say they're against the EU, but in questions of security, securing borders, and all those things, they actually have a very Europeanist discourse, all right? The FPÖ, the Front National, wouldn't have a problem if a European army existed, as long as it made sure to exist to seal off the borders, all right? So actually having a kind of a very isolationist or very sovereignist critique, there are elements in the way populism sees the world that is actually more engaged in the world. And if you think again about the global south, I think that what you see there is actually a populism that is much more engaging with the world. For the ideology behind Chavez was this Americanismo, this idea of an identity that Latin America itself has created because it's a post-colonial environment, it has been exploited by the US for too long. Erdogan makes references to the Muslim world or to the old parts where the Ottoman Empire existed. And even Vladimir Putin, who I think is a populist to the extent that he speaks in an agenda that is easily transferable to other parts of the world outside of Russia. Family values, traditional family, being anti-gay, and all those things. So my main point is that Populism is in itself, I think, should be seen as a concept in a value-free way. It is a style of populism, it is a language of politics, all right? In specific circumstances, it can be inclusive, it can actually infuse democracy in very democratic settings. It is a particularly pertinent development in a globalized world where national governments are seen as tied up and where international institutions are seen as non-responsive. And for something that we normally consider as very sovereignty or bound to a specific nation, populism is actually something that engages with the world, engages with other populist actors, engages in networks, is influenced by what happens in the world. You can think about the parallels of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson here, more than I care. So, altogether, yeah, think about it not in terms of policy, but in terms of a style of politics. Think about it as something that exists in other parts of the world, and think about it as something that has to be engaged with rather than brushed aside outright.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very interesting account at this late hour. I know it's very late, but we will have a quick question and answer session. Are there any questions from the audience at this moment? With the young man in the white shirt and the young lady up there.
What do you think the complete failure of modern politics is? It's completely failed to get perfect against populist movements in the Western world.
And you guys?
Yeah, it's difficult.
No, it was one more, sorry.
Sorry.
You.
I'm going to ask about reactions to populism, specifically Trump. Mr. White, you talked about betrayal and Theresa May going back to the South. But I also wanted to bring up Nicola Sturgeon and said she's going to continue to again Donald Trump to not engage with what was the best reaction.
Failures.
The failure of modern politics and the biggest failure to predict and to act upon it.
I think the inequality question is important, but since populism exists in countries, including Scandinavia, which has much higher levels of equality, social equality than countries like the US or the UK, then it's hard to ascribe all of that. It is a big driver. Several people mentioned the 1%. I think people in the 1% think the problem is the 0.1%. And there is a graph of wealth which reaches a point in the high 90s where it suddenly goes vertical. Mass migration of people is another failure. But in Western democracies, it seems to me we can't emphasize enough, and we sometimes forget that it's not Theresa May or Francois Hollande's fault that the Chinese Communist Party gave up communism. And in doing so, they've made earning a living a great deal harder for everybody else. Obviously, it's pretty good for 300 or 500 million Chinese at the moment, and good luck to them. But it has made the terms of business for everyone else harder, and that's not easy to explain to an unemployed Ohio or Newcastle factory worker, but it's very real.
And the second question, so I didn't quite hear.
I think one failure is clearly also the crisis of representative democracy has to do with mistakes that have been made. I think what happened over the last 20 years in Europe, this is not the case in the US, is there was a convergence between the center-right and the center-left parties that became virtually indistinguishable. There is no longer any big choice in voting for the one or the other. And there is also a strong tendency towards what has been called Tina politics. There is no alternative. Basically, outsourcing decisions to technocratic institutions, the European Central Bank or the IMF, and that is also, of course, hollowing out politics. And I think the rise of populism is related to this phenomenon. People want to have choice, and if it's not offered by the established parties, then to the left and the right of these new forces coming.
Can you repeat your question again, please?
build a strong relationship with him. But you also mentioned Nicola Sturgeon, and her response to it was to say, no, I'm going to continue to condemn what he said unless he radically changes his views. Don't want to deal with that. I just wonder what you thought about that. What you think the best action?
You're asking me? This is Mrs. Sturgeon Miss Sturgeon, sorry. She's married to the chief executive of the SNP. Interesting aspect of contemporary democratic politics is the extent to which they're dynastic. We got rid of the Clintons, the Bushes, and we've since installed the Trumps. The kids are running the blind trust, ho ho ho, and the son-in-law has got his windpipe on the appointments committee. And it's true here, where Ed Balls used to be in politics, you know, selling his wife. Ed Balls, the dancer. Scotland doesn't really have a foreign policy. It's a free kick for Nicola, good for her. But there are a lot of things in which, you know, it's an easy run. It's like saying England is xenophobic and Scotland welcomes foreigners. Well, the Scottish population has been declining and is currently pretty flat at 5 million. England has absorbed 5 million extra citizens in the last 12 or 15 years. So she's a great operator. She scores runs when she can see them, but you know, she's the Prime Minister of the Chief Minister of the devolved Assembly Parliament in Scotland, and good luck to her, but I don't get excited about it. And I'm sure Mr. Trump won't either, because when you read about Alex Salmond, her predecessor, not such a trustworthy person by any means as Nicola, Alex Salmond greasing for Donald Trump,